Today, we're diving into the extraordinary tale of Nelson Lee, a man whose life intersected with one of the most formidable Native American tribes of the American frontier, the Comanche. Captured in 1855, Lee survived 3 harrowing years among the Comanche before his daring escape in 1858. His experiences, documented in his book 3 Years Among the Comanches, reveal not just his personal journey, but also a window into the power and complexity of the Comanche people. In the 1850s, Native American tribes like the Comanche were fiercely defending their territories amidst the relentless westward expansion of settlers. The Great Plains, stretching from modern Kansas to western Texas and New Mexico, were marked by constant conflict, with native raiding parties targeting border settlements in an effort to resist encroachment. It was during this volatile period that Nelson Lee, a man in his late 40s, embarked on a journey that would change his life forever. Lee, an adventurous spirit, began his career as a sailor in the Navy before joining the Texas Rangers. His exploits included serving during the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, a conflict that reshaped the American Southwest and pushed the U.S. border deep into Mexican territory. After the war, Lee settled near Corpus Christi, Texas, making a modest living trading cattle and capturing wild horses. But it was here, near the frontier town, that Lee's path crossed with the Comanche. The Comanche were more than just a nomadic horse tribe. They were masters of the plains, an unparalleled cavalry force shaped by centuries of survival and adaptation. Before horses were introduced by the Spanish in the 1500s, the Comanche had been relatively marginalized, often outmatched by other stronger native groups like the Apache. But the arrival of the horse revolutionized their way of life, giving rise to a dominance that lasted for nearly 2 centuries. By the 1800s, the Comanche had become the most formidable native power in the Southwest, known as the Lords of the Southern Plains. Unlike the semi-agricultural Apache, who adopted horses but retained their farming practices, the Comanche fully embraced the nomadic horse culture. Horses became the cornerstone of their economy, warfare, and identity. They could travel hundreds of miles within days, striking with devastating speed and precision. Their raids, targeting settlers, travelers, and rival tribes, were often conducted under the cover of night, leaving little chance for defense. Yet the story of the Comanche is more than just one of violence or conquest. It's also a story of resilience. Their rise as a dominant force came after centuries of being pushed aside by other tribes. By the 19th century, their collective memory of displacement fueled their fierce resistance to external threats. Their way of life was a testament to adaptation and survival, even as external forces sought to undermine it. As we delve deeper into Nelson Lee's story, remember that his encounter with the Comanche reflects not only his personal trials, but also the broader narrative of native resilience, strength, and the complexities of cultural collision on the frontier. In 1855, Nelson Lee and his friend William Aikens embarked on a bold but foolhardy mission to drive a herd of mules westward from Corpus Christi, Texas, aiming for a mysterious destination Lee referred to as Matamoros. While historical maps provide no clear evidence of this town in California, their planned route was destined to intersect one undeniable truth. They would cross the heart of Comanche territory, a place notorious for its peril and unpredictability. The Comanche's range during this period was well documented, often marked explicitly on maps of the time as dangerous, even impassable, for settlers. Yet, Aikens remained convinced they could navigate through safely and reap substantial profits from their endeavor. It was a belief rooted more in blind optimism than in practical reasoning. The Great Plains were not just an obstacle. They were the sovereign domain of the Comanche, fiercely protected by a tribe that had honed its mastery of the region for generations. Lee and Aikens, undeterred by the warnings, assembled a group of hired men and loaded up on horses, driving their mules westward along the Rio Grande. Lee, ever the pragmatist, purchased a state-of-the-art pocket watch, a rare and expensive device for its time. This watch, which could be set to chime like an alarm, symbolized his intent to maintain strict discipline and regiment their journey. At precisely 3:30 a.m. each day, Lee's watch would signal the start of their laborious trek, ensuring the group moved efficiently and maximized their daylight hours. The journey began in early March, with the group traveling westward at a steady pace. The Rio Grande, with its stretches of nourishing grasslands, offered a critical resource for their mules, whose strength was essential to the expedition's success. But even with careful planning, the group's decision to enter Comanche territory showed a deep misunderstanding of the dangers they faced. By April, they reached a point southwest of El Paso and decided to rest their mules for several weeks. It was a logical choice. Well-fed and rested animals were crucial for the grueling miles ahead. However, the decision to pause here, deep within Comanche range, was a risky gamble. While they stationed sentinels each night to watch for potential threats, their efforts were ultimately futile against the highly skilled raiders they would soon encounter. The Comanche, experts in ambush and stealth, were known to strike with precision and without warning. Their intimate knowledge of the land and ability to utilize it to their advantage made them a near-invisible threat until it was too late. For Lee and his companions, their journey into Comanche territory was not just a logistical challenge. It was an act of defiance against a tribe whose dominance over the southern plains was unmatched. What happened next would underscore the peril of underestimating the Comanche's power. April 2, 1855, was a night Nelson Lee would never forget. At around 1 a.m., he finished his patrol, set his alarm, and settled down to rest, unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down. The stillness of the camp was shattered by blood-curdling screams. In the faint, flickering light of the campfire, Lee caught glimpses of dark, painted figures moving like shadows through the chaos. It was a Comanche raid. The sentinels, either caught off guard or incapacitated, offered no warning. Before Lee could react, he was lassoed, dragged to the ground, and swiftly bound by Comanche warriors. Around him, the camp dissolved into pandemonium. Shouts, whoops, and the dull thud of tomahawks filled the air as the raiders went tent to tent. Of the group, only 4 men survived: Nelson Lee, William Akins, and 2 hired hands, Thomas Martin and John Stewart. The rest met a brutal fate. The survivors were stripped of their clothing and outfitted in traditional Comanche garb, buckskin leggings, and hunting shirts. As the raiders plundered the camp, they stumbled upon Lee's pocket watch, a rare and intricate item at the time. Fascinated by the watch, they demanded Lee demonstrate its purpose. When it chimed, their astonishment was palpable. Lee, ever resourceful, seized the moment. He described how he solemnly wound the watch and made it chime again, deliberately invoking a sense of mystery and reverence. He later wrote that he believed the Comanche saw the watch as a supernatural object, possibly connected to the Great Spirit. Daylight revealed the full extent of the raid's horror. Lee's description of the aftermath is chilling. Bodies were mutilated in the most gruesome ways, disemboweled, scalped, and left as a stark reminder of the Comanche's mastery in psychological warfare. Scalps, still fresh, hung from the belts of the warriors, a grim testament to their dominance over the region. For Lee and his companions, the journey into captivity was a harrowing initiation into the Comanche's methods of psychological and physical control. To instill fear, the captors would faintly simulate scalping, brandishing bloodied tomahawks, grabbing at the captive's hair, and making the motion of scalping, only to stop at the last moment. These acts were more than cruelty. They were demonstrations of control and reminders of the captive's powerlessness. Traveling with the Comanche was an ordeal designed to dehumanize. The captives' faces were covered with deer skins, with small holes cut near the mouth to allow minimal breathing. Bound hand and foot, they were strapped to mules. If a captive fell, they would dangle helplessly with their legs tied to the animal. The Comanche found amusement in their suffering. Lee recounted how his somersaults off the mule became a source of laughter and mockery. Even meals were acts of intimidation. Boiling hunks of horseflesh were hurled at the captives, burning their skin. This macabre ritual was as much about sustenance as it was about asserting dominance, a way to keep the captives on edge and stripped of dignity. Nights brought little relief, as the captives were stretched out on their backs, hands and feet tied to stakes, with buffalo hide securing their throats, leaving them immobile and sleepless. While Lee's account highlights the terror and brutality he experienced, it is essential to understand the broader context. The Comanche's actions, though horrifying to settlers, were rooted in their struggle for survival and dominance in a rapidly changing world. As a people who had endured displacement and marginalization before their rise to power, their fierce resistance to settlers represented a continuation of their fight to protect their way of life. The raid was not merely an act of violence, but a strategic assertion of control over their territory. By instilling fear, the Comanche sent a clear message to outsiders. Their land was not to be crossed without consequence. Nelson Lee's harrowing account continues with the grim details of his captivity. After days of grueling travel, the Comanches subjected their captives to unimaginable physical and psychological strain. Lee writes of being forced to lie flat on his back, with arms and legs stretched and bound tightly to stakes driven into the ground. To immobilize him further, buffalo hide was tied under his chin, securing his neck to the ground. This cruel restraint left him unable to move head, hand, or foot, a living straitjacket that deprived him of rest and added to his torment. These conditions persisted for 4 grueling days. When not bound, Lee and the other captives faced equally dehumanizing treatment. Blindfolded and tied to mules, they were forced to endure dangerous rides where branches and terrain often caused them to fall. Lee recounts how the Comanche mocked his misfortune, treating his somersaults as comedic entertainment. Even meals were turned into tools of humiliation. Boiling chunks of horse meat were hurled at the captives, burning their skin as they scrambled to catch the searing morsels. This relentless cycle of physical discomfort and mockery underscored the captors' dominance. On the 4th day, the captives arrived at what Lee described as a vast Comanche village. Although Lee estimated the presence of 500 people and hundreds of tents, this number may have been an exaggeration, influenced by his fear and awe. The captives were paraded through the camp, eventually brought before the Comanche chief known as Big Wolf. This leader, whose name carries a sense of strength and mystique, had heard of Lee's peculiar pocket watch and demanded to witness its function. Lee's response to the chief's request reveals both his quick thinking and his desperation. Declaring that making the watch chime at that moment would wreck the world, Lee cleverly leveraged the Comanche's spiritual reverence for the unknown to avoid immediate harm. While Big Wolf appeared skeptical, he refrained from pushing the issue, a moment of reprieve for Lee. The respite was short-lived. Lee was taken outside the village, where a ritual of terror awaited. His fellow captives, Akins, Martin, and Stewart, were already there, bound and stripped. The captives were tied to tall posts, their hands raised high by ropes. Martin and Stewart stood side by side, while Akins was positioned opposite them. Lee, too, was stripped and tied alongside Akins, completing the grim tableau. What followed was a horrifying display of the Comanche's warrior culture. In a choreographed procession, warriors carrying tomahawks, knives, and flint spearheads circled the captives. The ceremony began with 2 warriors stepping forward to scalp Martin and Stewart, removing small patches of skin, an act Lee likened to the size of a silver dollar. Though alive, the 2 men bled profusely, their cries echoing through the clearing. The warriors continued their procession, letting out war whoops as they passed. They brandished their weapons, raking flint spearheads across Martin and Stewart's bodies. Wounds accumulated with each cycle, leaving the men bloodied and broken. The torment was both systematic and unrelenting, with the warriors seemingly drawing strength and purpose from the act. Lee and Akins, to their astonishment, were left untouched during the ordeal. The warriors passed by them multiple times, sparing them while focusing their cruelty on Martin and Stewart. Lee later reflected on the scene with words that captured the horror. How many times they circled round, halting the sound of war whoop and going through the same demonic exercise, I cannot tell. The psychological strain of witnessing such violence, compounded by the uncertainty of his own fate, left an indelible scar on Lee's mind. To the settlers, these acts appeared as unprovoked savagery, but within the context of Comanche culture, such rituals served a deeper purpose. These displays of dominance and brutality were not random acts of violence. They were affirmations of power, unity, and control. For a people who had faced centuries of displacement and marginalization, asserting authority over captives symbolized a reversal of roles, a way to reclaim agency in a rapidly changing world. For Lee, however, the ceremony marked a descent into a living nightmare. His survival hung by a thread, dependent on both his captors' whims and his ability to navigate their complex social and spiritual codes. This episode, with its blend of ritualized terror and psychological warfare, is a chilling testament to the lengths the Comanche would go to preserve their sovereignty and project their strength. The torment inflicted by the Comanche on Nelson Lee and his fellow captives reached its horrific climax as the ritual continued. Lee described the scene with haunting clarity. They persisted in a hellish work until every inch of the bodies of the unhappy men was hacked and covered with clotted blood. For Lee, the ordeal was so unbearable that he longed for the agency to choose his own death rather than endure the relentless cruelty of the Comanche. This harrowing episode underscores the psychological and cultural dimensions of the Comanche's rituals. As author S. E. Gwynn notes in Empire of the Summer Moon, the Comanche did not shy away from inflicting suffering. They embraced it. Gwynn writes, "Not only did they inflict horrific suffering, but by all evidence they enjoyed it. Making people scream in pain was fun for them. It was an important part of their adult culture, and one they accepted without challenge." Between acts of violence, the Comanche paused to smoke tobacco and mock their captives. They jeered at Martin for praying and pointed out the gruesome injuries inflicted on him and Stuart. The intermission was short-lived, and the ceremony resumed with a chilling war dance. Two warriors circled the captives before drawing their hatchets and delivering fatal blows to Martin and Stuart, their skulls crushed in a brutal instant. The bodies were discarded without ceremony, leaving Lee and Eakins bound and braced for their own deaths. Yet, to their astonishment, the ritual ended and they were spared for reasons Lee could not fathom. The psychological toll of witnessing such barbarity deeply scarred Lee, but he clung to the faint hope of survival. His pocket watch, revered by the Comanche as a supernatural object, became a tool of leverage. As Eakins would later advise, Lee's cooperation and the mystical aura of the watch could ensure his survival. Eakins told him they believed it to be a living spirit in a silver body. This insight became Lee's lifeline. Eakins, however, would not share Lee's fate. Sent to another camp, he offered a brief farewell and left Lee with his parting wisdom. From that moment, Lee never saw or heard of Eakins again, and he was presumed dead. For Lee, the years ahead would be marked by survival, resilience, and a relentless determination to escape. Over the next 3 years, Lee lived with various Comanche tribes. His pocket watch continued to command respect, traveling with him and maintaining its status as a mystical object. Following Eakins' advice, Lee adapted to his circumstances, becoming a servant to Big Wolf and other tribal leaders. He completed tasks as needed, gradually earning their trust. Eventually, he was allowed to move unbound within the camp and even carry a knife, a significant shift in his status. Big Wolf's tribe bestowed upon Lee the nickname Chumacacho, which translates to the good white man. While Lee's relationship with the tribe varied, he still faced cruelty, particularly from a master known as Spotted Leopard, who severely injured him following a failed escape attempt. Yet, moments of humanity shone through. Women in the tribe, such as a Comanche named Sleek Otter, offered him kindness and protection from the wrath of warriors. Lee's opportunity for freedom came during a journey with a chief named Rolling Thunder. Ironically, the trip was intended to address the growing threat of white settlers encroaching on Comanche territory. Sensing his chance, Lee seized a hatchet and struck Rolling Thunder, burying the dull edge into the chief's skull. In his own words, "Snatching the hatchet in that instant from its place, I leapt towards the chief and buried the dull edge of a broad hand's breadth into his brain." With the chief incapacitated, Lee armed himself with a rifle and knife, mounted a horse, and fled into the wilderness. His escape marked the end of a 3-year ordeal, a testament to his resilience and resourcefulness. Nelson Lee's escape was as much a battle of endurance as it was a triumph of will. He seized his moment of freedom with bold resolve, writing, "A moment sufficed to draw the rifle from beneath him and jerk the long knife from his girdle. Then, mounting his horse, I dashed wildly away over an unknown path toward the land of freedom." His flight marked the beginning of a harrowing journey through an unforgiving wilderness as he sought sanctuary in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. Navigating the vast and rugged terrain of the Southwest was no small feat. Lee faced natural barriers at every turn. Cliffs, mountains, and dense brush forced him to double back repeatedly. Signs of other native groups in the area kept him on high alert, as he knew his survival depended on avoiding any further capture. By day, he relied on the sun to guide him southward. By night, the North Star became his compass. Yet, even with his resourcefulness, the isolation and brutality of the landscape began to take their toll. Weeks into his escape, Lee's physical and emotional strength began to wane. He described his condition in haunting terms. "I was sick in body as well as soul. My limbs had become swollen, and the wounds and bruises that covered me were inflamed and painful. Day by day, I grew weaker as I advanced. Often I prayed God that when I fell asleep, I might never wake up again." These words capture the profound despair he faced, cut off from civilization and unsure if he would survive. After nearly a month on the run, even Lee's horse, his most vital companion, succumbed to exhaustion. Forced to abandon the animal, he pressed forward on foot, writing, "Now for the first time my heart died within me. For all I could discover, civilization was as far off as when I started the journey. I began to doubt myself, to fear that I'd become crazed." Alone and weakened, Lee pushed forward, driven by sheer determination. The wilderness itself seemed to conspire against Lee. Rattlesnakes and predators stalked the shadows, drawn by the scent of his kills after successful hunts. Even the essential act of building a fire to cook food or ward off the cold became a liability. The flames, visible over long distances, could attract attention. Comanche patrols or other hostile groups could easily discover his location. To mitigate this risk, Lee used natural features like cliffs and thick brush to obscure the light, turning survival into a delicate balance of necessity and concealment. Despite these challenges, Lee demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and resilience. His ability to navigate the terrain, avoid detection, and sustain himself amid such adversity speaks to both his survival instincts and his unyielding hope for freedom. Yet, as the journey wore on, it became increasingly clear that he was fighting a battle against his own body as much as the elements. Lee's escape is not just a tale of physical endurance, but a profound testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. The southwestern wilderness, with its harsh beauty and relentless dangers, became both his prison and his proving ground. Every step forward was an act of defiance against despair, a refusal to surrender to the forces that sought to break him. As we follow Lee's journey, we see not only the extraordinary resilience of one man, but also the stark reality of survival on the frontier, a reality shaped by the unforgiving landscape and the tensions between settlers and native tribes. For Lee, this journey was more than a physical escape. It was a test of his will to live. On the 56th day of his grueling escape, Nelson Lee's fate took a miraculous turn. Resting in an open prairie, he was startled by the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoing across the desolate landscape. Gripping his own rifle, he braced for another encounter with potential captors. But to his immense relief, the figures he saw approaching were not Comanche warriors. They were a group of Mexican hunters, identifiable by their wide-brimmed sombreros. They were deer hunting, Lee later recounted, a simple act that would become his salvation. The group, heading home to San Fernando, likely near modern-day Chihuahua, quickly recognized Lee's dire condition. Emaciated, unshaven, and unrecognizable after 3 years of captivity, Lee was a shadow of the man who had once traversed the American frontier. Compassionate and practical, the hunters took him in without hesitation. They offered him life's essentials, water, food, and a horse to ride. For a man who had survived on scraps and raw determination, the gesture was as nourishing to his spirit as it was to his body. The journey to San Fernando took a week, during which the Mexicans shared their limited resources with Lee, offering him what little they had without question or hesitation. For the first time in years, he could eat without fear, drink without rationing, and rest without being hunted. The kindness of these strangers was a stark contrast to the relentless hostility he had faced during his time in captivity. Once in San Fernando, Lee was taken under the care of a local doctor. For 6 weeks, he remained there, slowly regaining his strength and recovering from the physical and emotional toll of his ordeal. His wounds were treated, his body nourished, and his mind given the space to process the incredible journey he had endured. When Lee finally boarded a boat bound for New York, it marked the conclusion of 3 long, harrowing years. His time among the Comanche, defined by captivity, survival, and eventual escape, had come to an end. The journey northward was not merely a return to familiar territory. It was a symbolic crossing back into a life of freedom and safety, far removed from the brutal landscapes of the frontier. Lee's story is not only a testament to human resilience, but also a reminder of the humanity that can shine through even in the harshest circumstances. The generosity of the Mexican hunters, their willingness to save a stranger, ensured that Lee could live to tell his extraordinary tale, a story of survival, endurance, and the indomitable will to return home. In 1858, Nelson Lee stood once again on the familiar ground of the East Coast, far removed from the harsh and untamed frontier where he had endured unimaginable trials. Reflecting on his journey, Lee wrote, "I was home at last, and my adventures with the Indians were at an end forever. Although I would never forget the awful scenes of agony and torture I'd witnessed among them." His words capture the duality of his emotions, relief at his return to safety, and the haunting permanence of the memories he carried. Lee's escape from the Comanche and his eventual return to civilization were not just the culmination of years of struggle. They marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Settling into the relative calm of the East Coast, he no longer had to contend with the constant specter of violence that had defined his time on the frontier. The trauma of captivity, the loss of his companions, and the brutal realities of life among the Comanche were behind him, but they remained etched in his mind. Determined to ensure that his experiences were not forgotten, Lee began writing his memoir, 3 Years Among the Comanches. The book served not only as a recounting of his personal survival, but also as a vivid chronicle of life on the frontier. It offered readers a glimpse into the cultural collision between settlers and native tribes, the brutal dynamics of captivity, and the resilience required to endure such hardships. Lee's story resonated deeply in a nation grappling with westward expansion and the violent conflicts it often sparked. Lee's journey from captivity to freedom embodies the complexities of the 19th century American frontier, a land of opportunity, danger, and cultural entanglements. His narrative reflects not only his personal strength, but also the broader tensions between settlers and native tribes during this tumultuous period. While his return to the East Coast marked the end of his physical trials, it also symbolized his transition from participant in the raw, violent realities of the West to a chronicler of its stories. In his memoir, Lee ensured that the voices of his companions, the harsh beauty of the landscape, and even the practices of his Comanche captors would live on. His survival and the legacy of his writing remind us of the profound human will to endure, and the importance of preserving the stories of those who lived through history's most challenging moments.